A lot of people died. I mean, a lot of people in the street in particular. So.
Yeah. Do you know the date?
Oh yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Very much so.
Yeah.
And he's moved over to environmental sciences from planning.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was pretty recent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I must not have spoken to him that much.
Okay. Yeah.
Like the last 2 or 3.
I think it was like a couple years ago. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not probably sure, but yeah, there were no reasons that that took place, but hopefully it's good to work.
Yeah. It has so much like independent work happening that it's sort of like entrepreneurial within the university, that kind of.
Yeah, no, actually, there's been actually criticism of that from people I know who also want to do some of this, sort of, especially the Canopy and Heat sort of Heat Island, Red Line, and all those kind of things that are coming together. But, you know, it's got to do it. So
Yeah.
we'll do it. Cool. Yeah. Are there? I'm assuming you've got a number of folks online, or you're streaming? You're gonna stream it, right?
We are streaming.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
We definitely have.
Friday afternoon at 3:30.
I know. It is.
Mimi and Ashley. So
All right.
it's good.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, it's still just.
And even the 30 minutes, so I don't like orienting myself around. Hour.
I think we start stuff on time. Ish.
It's Friday.
Maybe it depends on the different.
I mean, I'm off for problems, but
You know, we got that whistle blowing. The car honking.
Yeah, what is the withdrawal?
it's a holdover from our industrial class, I guess. I don't know. Because it doesn't really time with class. Yeah, changing.
I think it's at the 45.
Yeah.
But it's regular, it's not like an emergency
No.
or celebration.
No, it's a regular feature.
Nice.
And then they have a
Great.
ceremony called when the whistle blows, is when at the end of the year, everybody who's died the previous year who worked for GT. And so I'm looking for it at the end of the day, it was like 18 whistles.
Yeah, and they have it at the camp now.
I have like 6.
Oh, anyone who works at QT.
Who had passed away in the last year.
And student.
It's, oh yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Students, anyone really good, but it's fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Start recording. Do we start? Oh, it's so hard.
We're gonna have my situation right now.
All right.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. We may have a few more.
Okay, bring it.
Are we good? All right, the person who's moderating the chat is now up here. So if the chat needs moderating. We just wait 1 second. All right, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. There might be some more people trickling in, so we'll let them trickle. It's my distinct pleasure today to introduce Dr. Zoé Hamstead from the University of California at Berkeley, from the Department of City and Regional Planning. Zoe is my friend, and she's an assistant professor in that department, and she works on environmental planning, sustainability, urban governance, environmental justice, all in the context of climate change. Zoe also is amazing because she's also had some practitioner roles in the past, being a land use planner and also working with the APA on some educational initiatives. And so we are really, really thrilled to have her today. Zoe, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Cleo. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. And thank you to Gusha and for others who have invited me and welcomed me and helped to coordinate my visit. I feel like I'm really getting the Southern hospitality treatment, and I'm like sort of identify as a Southerner. I'm originally from West Virginia and North Carolina, and I sort of miss this up South region. So it's super nice to be back. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is some work that I've started publishing on in the last couple of years, and I haven't actually gotten a ton of opportunity to present this work in full. I sort of presented some bits of it as as it was in progress at conferences, but then, I sort of slowed down my conference routine during COVID. And so it feels really like a incredible opportunity to come in and share this work with you. And I'm excited to get feedback on it as well. So I'm calling this new agenda that I'm starting to orient my research around as I'm sort of progressing, hopefully toward my mid-career. We'll see how tenure goes. Critical heat studies. And critical heat studies is an agenda that is concerned with the public health crisis associated with urban heat and climate change exacerbated heat. But it's one that aims to shift the current thermal discourse from its meteorological orientation to instead center people's everyday adaptive embodied experiences, and even experiences that we might call mundane, but important everyday adaptive thermal practices and struggles. So this critique, I'll say it sort of draws from my experience in community engagement processes around heat, co-production processes to develop management frameworks, what we might call thermal management frameworks for urban heat with urban planners, and in talking about experiences with heat and cold among residents in different kinds of communities. You may already know this. A large body of evidence finds that heat is among the foremost health threats posed by climate change. It's often described as a silent killer or an invisible threat. And heat is estimated to contribute to many more fatalities than other types of climate change exacerbated extreme weather. In the United States, the impacts are especially pronounced in racialized and racially segregated urban communities. Unlike hurricanes, tropical storms, and wildfires, heat waves infrequently cause physical damage to engineered infrastructure. That's not always the case. Like, we get electrical, energy blackouts. Heat can warp rail, it can cause problems in roadways, but generally, unlike other types of climate exacerbated hazards, we think more about the ways in which heat impacts people physiologically through their physical health, psychologically through their mental health, and materially in conjunction with or mediated by social determinants of health, like energy and housing, and food security and transportation access and things like that. In August of 2020, the Arsh Rockefeller Foundation founded the Extreme Heat Alliance, which is an alliance of cities and organizational partners, which they intend to address the threats posed by urban heat. The then director of the foundation stated that creating a standard practice of naming and ranking heat waves, as is done with tropical storms, would be the alliance's top priority for addressing what she called an invisible threat, a silent killer lurking in plain view. 2 years later, in August of 2022, the city of Seville, Spain, actually did name a 2-week-long temperature event, Zoé, after my name, of course, because they know my work, right? Just kidding. But they proudly, in that year, became the first city to officially name a heat wave. When naming heat waves was proposed by the Extreme Heat Alliance, it was not a new idea. In 2017, the British had nicknamed a heat wave Lucifer. And Brian Stone, in your department, called for systematic heat wave naming in his policy nook that was published in the Journal of Extreme Events in 2019. After I read Brian's piece, I actually got slightly obsessed with this idea of naming weather. Is that me?
Sorry, I hope that.
Yeah, I got slightly obsessed with this idea of naming weather, and I kind of went down a fun rabbit hole of feminist literature about naming hurricanes. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this history. The US Weather Service used to only name hurricanes female gendered names. And in 1969, after a particularly bad hurricane season and particularly misogynist reporting about those hurricanes, the NOW, the National Organization for Women, sent a cease and desist letter to the US Weather Service demanding that they cease the practice of only associating hurricanes with the female gender. And the Weather Service meteorologist said, no, we have to continue this practice because people won't take male gendered hurricanes seriously. Speed ahead, a study actually looked at like a 62-year history of gendered hurricane names and found the opposite to be the case, that people are more likely to evacuate for Hurricane Bob than Hurricane Betty. It's kind of beside the point, but kind of on point.
Do you know that COVID is la in French?
La?
Oh, yeah, it's just, you know, yeah, it's a female.
It's female. It's a female gender. Nice. But long before this, urban public health professionals, climatologists, and others have been sort of bemoaning the invisibility and the slow violence and the silence of extreme heat, and naming and ranking heat waves are some of the latest attempts to event mentalize heat, to make it into an event that is memorable, that is embedded in our consciousness and our culture. What I'm going to present to you is ultimately an argument that heat and attention may be less a matter of attunement to the weather and more of a matter of political economy, an urban political economy in particular, that is not structurally set up to secure basic needs for many urban residents. So while personifying heat waves, naming them after gods and goddesses and archangels is valuable for those who have the capacity to adjust behaviorally, and perhaps even in setting regulatory settings, in setting regulatory standards, especially in settings like workplaces and labor landscapes, where heat can be really, really dangerous and people don't necessarily have protections. I think that addressing heat as a fundamental human security challenge requires a broader reconceptualization of its meaning, and one that derives from scholarship that is more grounded in the human experience of heat and more politicized than the one that we have to date. So that's kind of the argument that I'm going to put forward to you today. So the way that I'm sort of organizing this argument is to first begin by sort of describing, like, as succinctly as I can without elaborating all the nuance around this field, which does have a lot more nuance than I'm going to present to you, the kind of state of affairs of heat studies, what I'm calling heat studies, which come from, they stem from a range of different disciplines, and how those heat studies are influencing thermal management, the practices, the strategies, the governance of heat and even cold, let's say, that's happening in the urban environment and by urban planners in particular. Then I'm going to try to raise some epistemological tensions. So what I'll put to you is that these heat studies, which are informing thermal management, are primarily making meaning of heat as a scientific object, which it is. Like it is a scientific object, but they're neglecting the fact that it is also a cultural practice. And I think that having a more robust practice of thermal justice as one subdiscipline and sector, let's say, of environmental justice practice requires engaging with it as a cultural practice as well. And so I'm going to propose a kind of theoretical reframing, some principles that I think we can orient our study of heat around to get at heat as a cultural practice. And then I'm going to dig in a little bit more to one of these principles, which I'm calling thermal insecurity, which really raises the politics of heat, the ways in which power differentials play a role in structuring, like who suffers and who's able to adapt. Okay, so heat studies. So heat studies I'm defining as a body of diverse works that come out of diverse scholarly traditions, including public health, landscape ecology, geography, environmental management, urban planning, sociology, and others, that are looking at relationships across health, space and place, built environments, and thermal conditions. Some, like this study, which I'm using this image to represent, are leveraging epidemiological data in order, in this case, to understand how are increases in mortality related to changes in temperature. In this case, we're looking at counties across the state of New York. And this study was really, really interesting to me because at the time I had been living in New York City where I did my PhD, and I know how hot it gets in the Bronx. based on my time. I didn't live in the Bronx, but I hung out there a little bit, and it was hot in the summer. And then I moved to Buffalo, New York, and Buffalo is a city in the county of Erie. And Buffalo is associated with cold winter weather, and it is like not known for its heat, but as you can see, the mortality rates between the two counties are quite similar for the same temperature change. And I got to know through some of my fieldwork there that in fact people do suffer on both ends of the temperature spectrum in all kinds of seasons. So this is the kind of study that, you know, is trying to connect health information to thermal information. This is a study that was published more recently that tried to look at this from a global perspective. This image is from a modeling study that was published in 2021 in The Lancet. It examined a 20-year data set of mortality and ambient temperature and in 43 countries, and estimated over 5 million deaths due to non-optimal temperatures. Over 8%, the vast majority were cold related, and less than 1% heat related. At the more urban and intra-urban level, some work like this is our images from my dissertation research in New York City, have tried to connect the built environment with thermal effects. So in this case, trying to identify thermal signatures in the urban landscape, what kinds of built environment features and landscapes are different temperature signatures associated with. We can then try to link that to population-based sensitivities, as we know that, you know, for example, the elderly or people who are living in poverty can be more sensitive for a variety of like physiological and economic reasons to health impacts during heat waves. So trying to like overlay some of these things and understand disproportionate exposures. And then ultimately, some studies are also using that kind of information about the built environment and the built environment's relationship to thermal or thermometric measures to health impact, health outcomes, like this study that was published by Sharon Harlan in 2013, Sharon Harlan and her colleagues in 2013, which was able to connect deaths in different locations, in different neighborhoods across Phoenix with built environment characteristics. Thermal management practices enacted by bureaucracies include a range of management approaches within fields of public health, emergency management, local government planning, and meteorology that intervene in making people aware of thermal threats and also altering thermal landscapes and otherwise making biophysical changes that reduce the negative impacts that thermal landscapes have on society. So just to highlight a couple of things, I've already mentioned naming heat waves, and you know what how interesting I find that. So there are also some efforts to begin ranking heat waves. So California has a new heat officer. I don't think that's actually his precise title, but a new head of heat for the state. And they're working on efforts to rank extreme heat wave events, and also to set standards for cooling, which is quite a difficult policy to construct and to enact. So, but you know, for a long time in the United States, the National Weather Service has had a ranking system where they associate heat index, humidity, and temperature with varying degrees of danger, and send out warnings. And so these are some of the efforts around what I'm calling extreme heat eventfulness, right? An effort to create some sense of meteorological punctuation around which like communities and individuals and households can reorient their behavior, right, in response to thermal changes. And then the other sort of suite of policies which I want to point out are what I might call like climate urbanism. So improving the capacity of the built environment to mitigate heat through altering albedo, so changing the reflectivity of the surface of materials, improving processes of evapotranspiration, et cetera. So Brian Stone's work on land uses climate mitigation has been really influential and empowering to planners in particular at the local level in showing that local governments can do things to tackle climate change that don't require collective action at a global scale. Like there are really practical approaches that city planners can take to both addressing climate change and making urban thermal environments more comfortable for people, right? And heat mitigation efforts, I would say, are among a broader suite of strategies that cities are using to enhance climate security alongside things like flood control, stormwater management, et cetera. So like I said, there's a lot more nuance than I'm presenting here. And more recently, researchers have become really, really interested in particular at understanding, like at a very individual level, what is someone's health risk that can be associated with thermal changes, and really using very personalized health information in order to be able to do that. But a couple of things that I want to point out about the limitations of like a lot of the research to date is that, especially some research that has begun looking at indoor built environments, residences, where in some geographies, at least, like oftentimes in the United States, this is the case, that is where people are experiencing the most risk. That is where people are spending the most of their time. These studies have shown that people's heat-related health risk can be more driven by the indoor built environment, especially in the home, and that the outdoor environment at which measurements are being taken at fixed points, measurements of temperature and humidity and these kinds of thermometrics, do not necessarily map onto what people are experiencing in their home. In the context of planning, especially environmental planning, like I sometimes call myself an environmental planner, you know, we think about parks and public rights of way and green spaces. Like we're not necessarily thinking about the interior of people's homes, the insulation, the weather stripping, like that's building science and architecture and housing, right? That's not environmental planning. But it is actually environmental planning, especially in the context of climate security, right? And protection against the threats that heat poses. And I think that, like in many cases, planners in practice, not only, you know, environmental planning academics, are thinking of those private spaces as beyond the purview of the public realm in which they can easily intervene. More fundamentally, what I want to argue, though, is that thermometrics are limited in their ability to explain the differential impacts of heat. So it is possible to capture some of the ways in which individual or community level identities relate to increased or decreased exposure or increased or decreased health outcomes. But how do we explain that? How do we explain how that's coming about? How do we explain like precisely why people in some communities aren't able to adapt to heat and in other communities they are? And one way I've come to think about sort of the interconnected heat scholarship and practices that I've tried to like kind of quickly summarize for you and sort of at a surface level, is they're akin to the first generation environmental justice research that was starting to be produced in the 1980s in the United States. And here I'm showing the example of the famous Toxic Waste and Race in the United States report that was published by the United Church of Christ in 1987, which showed that Hispanic and Black communities were much more likely to live near uncontrolled toxic waste sites, and that race was a much bigger predictor of your exposure to uncontrolled toxic waste sites than income was. And so this is, you know, where we really started to see the development of the notion of environmental racism. Distributional injustice research like this operationalizes social difference indicators to establish important facts about how benefits and burdens are distributed. In the decades following the beginning of the environmental justice movement, though, scholars and activists have developed and leveraged other notions like procedural injustice and recognitive injustice to help explain the processes and practices and the mental models through which distributive injustices are enacted. And I think for heat, we don't yet have a great framework for articulating a whole lot beyond distribution. So this is the epistemological challenge that I want to put forward. My claim is that we're treating heat as a scientific fact and not as a cultural experience. And that is limiting our ability to understand some of the other injustice dimensions that are really important for theorizing heat inequity and thermal inequity. When we talk about heat, we're often using temperature as a proxy for heat, not exclusively temperature. We also talk about humidity, and people who are doing like really sophisticated urban climatology research are using measures like mean radiant temperature and measures which get much closer to the human experience of heat as people, are sort of going about their lives in various kinds of thermal landscapes. So there are much better ways to measure the thermal environment than simply temperature alone. But I'm just kind of using temperature as a rough proxy for all of that here to say that when we talk about heat, we're using these thermometric measures. And that Hasek Chang, in his book, Inventing Temperature, traced to the origins of meteorology. The temperature record, consistently collected meteorological observations, began in the 17th century in England in what he describes as a more than century-long search for fixed points, which could be used as thermometric benchmarks. It's an incredible story that he tells of how it took nearly 100 years to simply create a temperature index and be able to apply it practically. That was a very difficult thing to do, around which a lot of effort was oriented. Scott Schwartz, who published this, he's a kind of science and technology studies anthropologist, published a work called Temperature and Capital in 2017, where he called temperature a discursive concept that was produced approximately 300 years ago. He argues that temperature, unlike heat, is about determining how certain materials respond to energy fluctuation in a controlled environment. It's not about relative warmth. The period in which meteorology was being developed, the period that these scholars like Chang and Schwartz are describing, was also the period of empire building and colonization. And meteorology was especially important in the process of empire building because it was like pretty essential to know what the climate and what the weather was going to be like in these geographies that were foreign to Western Europeans as they were investing in those geographies for agriculture and for resource extraction. For those investments to be profitable, you needed to know how they could possibly be impacted by the weather. You also needed to know how to navigate an ocean. Like, it's important to understand how to measure things like wind speed and direction. Contemporarily, there are a number of scholars, perhaps most notably Mike Hulme, who's a British geographer, who are trying to push back on this idea that in order to understand, actually, I just want to mention one more thing about this because I have some images and a reference from Luke Howard. So Luke Howard is often called the father or the godfather of meteorology. And he has this really interesting excerpt in this work that I'm referencing here, The Climate of London, deduced from meteorological observations made in the metropolis and the various places around it, where he says that the human senses are an imperfect judge of heat and cold. which is sort of an absurd thing to say if you think about it. Like, who knows better than you if you're hot or cold? But he says humans are an imperfect, human senses are an imperfect judge of hot or cold. To be able to understand varying warmths with accuracy, one must be accustomed to the use of the thermometer. And he raves about the thermometer and describes how to use it properly and how it's developed and so forth. And so it's sort of it sounds ridiculous to think that like a thermometer would know better what is warm or cold or hot or overheated than a human would. But there's this real effort to try to quantify with precision what like varying differences across thermal environments or objects would be. So as I was saying, Mike Hulme is like one of these science and technology studies scholars. He's a geographer who's trying to like kind of push back on the idea that in order to understand climate and in order to understand weather, we must be able to quantify it. He says climate change is not making sense to us. We have universalized the idea of climate, detached it from its cultural settings, and failed to read the ways in which the knowledge claims emerging from climate science change meaning as they travel. Out of the kind of critical climate science scholarship that is based in science and technology studies, more recently there has emerged a really a literature that I've started to find really interesting around weathering. One of the scholars, or some of the scholars in this arena are Vanini and colleagues who have described weather as an active, reflective, practical disposition to endure, sense, struggle, manipulate, mature, change, and grow in processes that over time implicate the placemaking of one's dwelling. Weather portraits that are described in this scholarship, which have provided narratives of pretty diverse places from British Columbia to the Australian tropics to the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, which is a very, very harsh, windy, cold environment, are drawing on a kind of feminist politics of difference and intersectionality to talk about how adaptive and maladaptive practices and agency and powerlessness and resistance play out in people's everyday sort of mundane and embodied experiences. I don't see a whole lot of this in the heat space, with the exception of some of the work that has been done by a scholar called Oppenheimer and colleagues in Australia. But I was really intrigued by some work that was done in New York City when I was working on my PhD. That was a collaboration between IC Change, which is a New Orleans-based climate change tech company, that partnered with WNYC, the local radio station, to both take thermal measurements inside people's homes. I think people primarily living in definitely affordable low-income housing, I think primarily public housing in New York City, but also to record the experiences from their own perspective. And so they were able to capture a lot of really interesting stories from people. Some of them are, people describing what it feels like in their body to be hot. I get dizzy, what it feels like in your mind. It's hard to focus and think. They describe some of the practices and strategies that people use to stay cool, like kids sleeping on an air mattress in the floor to avoid the heat that's rising to the top of the room. And some of the struggles that people have with, for example, their energy company. We have air conditioners in the kitchen and bedroom, but Con Ed is limiting how high it goes, right? So people are experiencing this barrier that's being set by their energy company. I was really excited about this project because there were a lot of insights about people's adaptive practices and struggles that were coming out of it. So when I got my first faculty job at SUNY Buffalo, I decided that I really wanted to do that kind of work. I wanted to talk to people, especially in their homes, about the kinds of thermal experiences that they were having. And I knew that Buffalo was meant to be cold, so I thought we'd be talking a lot about cold. We did, but we also talked about heat, which was sort of interesting. And I just want to share, I want to share some of my field notes from this project with you, some field notes on weathering Buffalo cold and heat. So I'm just going to be reading to you for a few minutes. She has lived in the home for 42 years. Some of the older homes that she lived in the past had now illegal space heaters that you light with a flame and had little ventilation. She uses a wide variety of means to keep her home insulated and warm. She said it's even draftier in the downstairs apartment. She has 3 small plug-in space heaters that emit heat outward with a radius of a few feet. She uses them when she has guests and people are in the living room. She also has a baseboard space heater, but doesn't use it because it makes the electric bill too expensive. She uses draft dodgers on windows and doors throughout the entire home and uses caulk and plastic wrap on the windows. She built a cardboard wall that she uses to block off the front section of the home. The wall does not reach the top of the ceiling. Sometimes the living room windows are too drafty when it's windy. Her cardboard wall helps to prevent drafts from reaching the rest of the house. The wind is so strong that it pushed the aluminum frame of her balcony door in and broke the weather stripping that she made on it with tape. The cold weather irritates her asthma. She experiences a shortness of breath due to asthma. They've been in the home for 2 years. They are medicated for schizophrenia. They don't have a job due to disability. They only take the bus occasionally and usually bike due to cost. They feel they are more at risk to heat-related illness outside due to the sun. This is especially since they ride their bike a lot and are at risk to sunburn because of medications. They only leave to go to the doctor, 2 doctors and 2 counselors, and the food pantry. They find it harder to breathe on hot days. The sun makes them feel more aggressive. Swelteringly hot and stuffy in the upstairs apartment, and the air conditioner couldn't suffice for the entire apartment. Direct sun is also rough as it causes sunburn. There are days when it's hotter indoors than outdoors because of no breeze. She applied and was approved for HEAP, heating assistance, and a National Grid stipend a half year ago. She also tried for cooling assistance, but didn't get it. It was a frustrating experience that started in November, and payments didn't go through until April to August. She took multiple mornings off from work to go to the interview for HEAP because the instructions weren't clear. Lines were long, with very few people working there. And then there's just another direct quote on a slide, which is something that a mother who's a immigrant from Bangladesh told me. She said, I came to Buffalo with my 2 sons who are 7 and 10. They had a very hard time. I could not afford to stay in any other city. I knew that it was cold. I started with $350, which is what the monthly rent cost. I was happy to have 2 bedrooms, but when the winter weather came, the children had a very hard time. I used to wash my dishes and used to cry. I didn't let anyone know that I was crying because of cold. Surviving in a different weather is very hard. I learned a lot from these interviews and this field experience, a lot of things like I really couldn't have understood without going into people's homes. I didn't understand, like it wasn't apparent to me that you could have a home, so you're like not unhoused, you technically have shelter, but that shelter is not like really properly protecting you from the elements in this type of weather. There were a lot of really interesting things that I took away, but I think like that one of the big picture takeaways for me confirms what other research on weathering has found, which now like it sounds obvious probably when I say it, but people are very attuned to the forces that threaten their health. And when the weather is health threatening, people become very attuned to the weather. There's a lot of emphasis, I think, on informational campaigns to teach people about the types of thermal conditions that are dangerous for them. And I think that is still incredibly important in spite of like these kinds of findings that people are attuned to the weather, especially because with the changing climate, thermal conditions are going to change so rapidly and places are going to become like literally unlivable so rapidly that people won't be prepared for it. But at the same time, what I think we are going to neglect unless we pay attention to it is that heat is not necessarily about the weather as much as it is about your relationship to your landlord or your energy provider or
Question.
Okay.
Get hold of the text from the app. Like, I just download the app myself. You know, you write the text block. Right?
the icy change.
Yeah, yeah. You just write the.
I don't know offhand. It's not I didn't make the app.
But the passage you're reading, these passages.
Uh-huh.
From the app?
No,
Oh, this one-
this is from my interviews. Yeah, I didn't use any. These were like
How did you access it? I'm quite curious about
how I got people to let me agree.
Yeah. how did that go?
Yeah, so I went through what I learned from some interlocutors who like really helped me, you know, connect with communities when I came to Buffalo, is that Buffalo is sort of governed by block club. There's these things called block clubs. Sometimes they're called like taxpayer associations or, you know, neighborhood associations. And those are kind of in a lot of communities, those are sort of the trusted institutions. And so I got the block clubs to let me come in and talk to people. And then I also provided an incentive, like a cash incentive. Yeah. But yeah, I was spending a lot of time with people because we also had like sensors inside people's homes and we had to come and download information from those periodically. So we were sort of asking a lot from people and they were like really kind to let us intrude in that, you know, in that really private space. So at one level, like, you know, heat is very much about weather and climate and the kinds of thermal changes that we experience in these landscapes. But on another level, I want to say, you know, it's fundamentally a human experience. And that experience is very much defined by the power relations that constrain our ability to adapt. And that is what I am arguing more research needs to be dedicated to understanding. So I articulate what I'm calling this like critical heat studies agenda, which is trying to get more at the cultural meaning and the power structures that define people's experiences with heat through these, what I'm calling like these 4 principles. And I'm just gonna like talk about them super quickly. You might want to discuss them more. And also I would say like these principles aren't fully fleshed out in my mind. I think there's like a lot more work to do here. But they are: heat is socially produced, heat is institutionally sanctioned violence, intersectionality and heat epistemologies, and thermal insecurity. So these first 2 principles are my way of sort of flagging the lack of attention to the injustice dimensions beyond distribution that I think we can be paying more attention to. So when I say heat is socially produced, I mean, one, that heat is constructed in the built environment through policy and planning and development processes. And that is known, like, and that is studied in the context of heat scholarship. But it's also constructed discursively as an objective meteorological fact, when in fact it is a subjective experience, it is this embodied experience. It is very personal, and it is also a cultural experience. When I say that heat is institutionally sanctioned violence, I'm in part drawing from the work of Rob Nixon and others who have thought about slow violence, right? To say that this is not spectacular violence. And when we call heat silent, and when we call it invisible, it's not because temperature is something we can't see with our eyes. Like, we can feel when we're hot and we can feel when we're cold. I think that the invisibility in the silence has more to do with the fact that we accept structural inequities, that the urban political economy functions with a particular set of power dynamics, which are structural. The second 2 principles are sort of intended to be more generative and trying to create like a path forward for the kind of scholarship that I'm calling for. So intersectional and heat epistemologies has to do with, again, like shifting from a meteorological orientation to instead focusing on lived experiences that illuminate the forms of agency that people use to struggle within interpersonal, bureaucratic, and contractual relations that constrain adaptation. So I've been trying to look at this like in the residential home environment, and oftentimes that means like a landlord-tenant relation, or maybe like an energy provider-customer relation. But if you're, to look at this in like a labor landscape, a workplace, it might be an employer and a wage labor. I think there are a lot of different contexts in which like we might think about the different types of relationships that are constraining people. And then thermal insecurity is one that I want to unpack a little bit more, because this is like a notion that I'm trying to get at more in my research. So I published a paper in Urban Studies last year called Thermal Insecurity, Violence of Heat and Cold in the Urban Climate Refuge, where I like present the work that I did in Buffalo. And what I'm trying to do with this notion of thermal insecurity is to sort of leverage the United Nations Development Program's notion of human security, which was a way of saying security is not just about militarization. The referent of security is not just nation states. It is also individuals, and it is also households, and it's also communities. And again, it's not just about the military, it's about food access and water access and housing security and energy security and so forth. So I'm trying to in part like leverage that notion of human security and also add to the vocabulary, and by so doing to connect the thermal to these other social determinants of health. And so on the one hand, it's about kind of adding to these vocabularies, but it's also about saying that like thermal security is a normative right. It's a normative goal, and it's like a human right in the same way that water and food and housing and energy are. It's really about, from the social determinants of health perspective, which argues that we can't only understand health from a medical perspective. It's also a matter of who has access to secure housing, energy, food, water, et cetera. The thermal is sort of adding to another dimension of security. And in that context, what is really of interest to me is like who has agency over the built environment, and how are relations structuring who has agency. So again, I mentioned like these in the context of housing, but there could be many other really interesting relations to explore in other spaces. I don't know if I should stop here. 10 minutes. I mean, I could stop here, or I could like point out a couple. Should I stop for questions? Okay. Yeah, I could. I'll just like super quickly just mention a couple of projects from my ongoing research that are sort of trying to operationalize this notion of thermal insecurity. And one has to do with weatherization. So there's like a lot of federal dollars right now to weatherize homes, to do home retrofits and decarbonizations, to electrify residential buildings in the US. And I've been working with a number of like local government agencies and a regional one that have a lot of money to spend. It's not enough money to do all of the weatherization that needs to happen to the residential building stock, but they can't get enough programmatic uptake. And they find it really, really difficult to access the rental housing space. Particularly in any type of housing that isn't deed restricted, that isn't like run by nonprofit affordable housing providers. And there are a number of reasons for that. So a lot of people are pointing to this issue of the split incentive that like, even if it is free money, it costs the landlord in terms of their time, in terms of, the administrative bureaucratic headache. But also there's this issue that it is like poor housing quality and sometimes even like illegality and lack of compliance with health and safety standards that is keeping housing affordable, especially in these crazy markets like everywhere now. But the Bay Area of California is sort of ground zero for a crazy housing market. So that's a really interesting project in which we're like working with these weatherization providers and interviewing landlords and tenants about like what their sort of incentives and barriers are around these weatherization programs. And then in another project, also in California, I'm working with my colleague, Zach Lamb, who's an expert on manufactured home parks or mobile homes, trailer parks, which who knew, I didn't, you might, the largest source of affordable housing in the United States, largest source of unsubsidized affordable housing, and unsubsidized affordable housing is larger source than subsidized affordable housing. They are not mobile, despite the name mobile housing or mobile home. And they're predominantly in urban areas. They're not necessarily a rural housing type. They're not in the center of a city, but they're like where development was happening in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, sort of on that, what used to be the periphery in those time periods. And the structure is often such that people will oftentimes own their home, sometimes rent the home, but oftentimes own it, but they don't own the land that it sits on. And so they pay rent on that land, which can cause a lot of insecurity. I mean, as you can imagine, can cause a lot of housing insecurity just in general if the landlord decides to like raise the rent on the land or decides to sell the property. But in the context of climate change, it can be especially problematic because if you have, you know, some disaster like a flood event, the landlord might just totally decide to abandon that community. Or if you have problems with infrastructure, for example, in the Central Valley, there was a community that got flooded a year ago, last February, so in winter, and because it was flooded for 2 weeks, the electricity was out for 2 weeks in February, and it gets very, very cold, especially in these like manufactured homes that don't have good insulation, they're very thin walls, etc. And because the landlord was just kind of absentee and wasn't there to deal with, wasn't there to turn on a pump, which did exist to pump out the water, you know, they were without power and freezing. And so in really interesting ways, like both because of the infrastructure that is owned and managed by a landlord, and also because the cost of the land is separate from the home, they're like really interesting ways in which, you know, housing and climate and security sort of come together in these spaces. So we're doing some investigation, or we're doing an ownership census of who owns all the mobile home parks across the state of California. And then looking at various climate vulnerabilities that people in these parks are experiencing. So I'll basically end by just, you know, saying I'm really interested in, you know, the concepts of thermal attunement and endurance, that those are part of cultural practices that people are engaged in that we like don't really understand well. We don't talk a lot about in heat scholarship. I want to like repeat the claim that health protector barriers are less a function of like awareness oftentimes than they are a function if you have agency over the built environment. And that when we talk about heat as a silent and invisible killer, I think this is probably less a matter of apprehension, because in fact, our sense of touch is quite good. And we are quite good at knowing how hot and cold we are. I think this is more about a kind of cultural normalization, a reluctance to problematize these really everyday kinds of exploitations that we're used to around like housing insecurity and energy insecurity and the inaccessibility of basic like those. So I would love to hear your thoughts and critiques about my critical heat study. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. What I'd like to do now is take one question from the audience. We'll do one from virtual, and then we'll open it up for the end of the audience, unless we get more virtual ones. So does anyone want to kick us off?
Question. I don't know. Also, I thank you so much for your wonderful talk. We really learned a lot. And I know a group of brilliant researchers from College of Design and also IPAD, which is an interdisciplinary research institute. I know if Artie and Maureen is online, so I'll probably be paying their question. So basically, we're really interested in understanding the impact of heat on people with disabilities. And I'm wondering from your past research, have you came across this any one that belongs to this group? And from the interview process that you did in Buffalo or in New York, like that, we're curious to see if you have any experience working with.
Yeah, so there, as I mentioned, like there is a new position of like heat leadership and a new heat office in the state of California. They engaged in a lot of listening sessions with communities around the different regions of California. And one thing that came up repeatedly during those listening sessions is that the disability community is really being left out of the conversation. I mean, I think what I heard in a lot of those conversations was just like at a very baseline level, like the communications are not appropriate for the disability community, let alone like, yeah, the ways in which people of who are differently abled experience the built environment.
So street disability. And disabled, what do you, the very term?
Well, I'm not an expert, right? A bit broadly can categorize the mental and orphan.
Yeah. I think the schizophrenia would qualify as a disability.
Yeah.
That example.
Yeah, I mean, that example is pretty interesting because my understanding, and I'm not like a medical expert, but my understanding is that the medication that oftentimes people with schizophrenia take makes them less able to thermoregulate and less able to like detect thermal changes. Although that individual like was talking about heat and changes that they would experience during the heat. So I mean, there's definitely like a lot of awareness, but there could be like less sensitive, like more sensitivity physiologically, but less, less physical awareness at the same time. And so yeah, like certain medications certainly like pose problems for people as one example.
I've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and where it came from was depressed. I have bipolar. It's taken 14 years. I've been on everything on this.
And have you noticed anything like in the summertime heat that feels different to you?
Really? The thing is, what's more, what I'm going to say is that the definition is more from the DSM. It's coming from psychiatry. Okay, so it's like basically what's happened is the apparatus of psychiatry, even though it's a very ill-defined, like someone says, you have some problem, right? It's like something happens in your life. My case, it was like first problem, divorce. I was in a lab, and I was taken from MIT. MIT was to Whitehead, took me to MIT Medical, diagnosed me with bipolar 1. 14 years later, I've been in and out of mental hospitals 15 times. But the main thing is, I would say it's actually a lot to do with psychiatry itself. The apparatus of medicine, the brain is a black box. We don't know what's going on. And what's really happening is, it has a lot to do with law enforcement. The way that at the beginning of something that happens to you, first thing that happens, someone calls 911, happened to me. And then it's like you go down this, it's basically like an apparatus of field system. It's like a pre-run, and that's what I'm writing. I'm writing a book about mental health and trucking. I picked it because truckers are the ultimate mobile home. Every trucker that rides at your tail on the interstate is living in their truck. Their house is their truck. You see what I'm saying? And just today, look at CNN in Texas, an 18-wheeler ran the Department of Public Safety, and they're calling it a criminal act. This is just today. So it's like, if you think about it, we like the way that you can open up this issue is how do you break down something that somebody can measure? That's why trucking thing. Like what I'm pursuing, but it's really like schizophrenia is a racially segregated diagnosis. They call it urbanism, the medical term. It's a very important term. You grow up in a concrete jungle where there's gunshots, whatever, and you're more likely to get it.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that.
A lot.
Thank you for that. We're gonna take one from
Okay.
virtual. This is from Ashley. She says, great talk, thank you. Can you speak to the role of participatory science in constructing heat? So participatory science in constructing heat and also in giving agency to residents. So the role of participatory science in constructing heat and in giving agency for residents.
Would Ashley be able to expand on like how they're thinking of, if there is like a particular way they're thinking about participatory science?
Yeah, I will go ahead and ask you here, but we have a very imperfect science here.
We have a very participatory.
Hey, can you all hear me? I
Yes.
tried to unmute. Oh, great. So yes, I do work in citizen science, and there's many different initiatives around collecting heat, temperature, measurements, either like, I think icy change that you were describing is a solid example. And also there are ones that are led by like NOAA, where they have people drive around with heat sensors, and there's been similar initiatives in Atlanta as well. So I'm wondering from your perspective, how that fits in with this idea of like the social construction of what heat is and what heat means. And then also if that could be like a potential path to giving more agency to residents to control kind of their built environment through this participatory data collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think those kinds of processes, those kinds of like participatory science projects can be especially powerful when people who are collecting the information like live in communities, because they can relate like the information that they're collecting, these like often like the NOAA projects that are happening in different cities, including Atlanta, are collecting like transects, right, of thermometric observations. And when you live in that city, that's like a transportation route that you take on a regular basis. You can start to like relate those differences that you're observing to the experiences that you have, and also what you know about like what would be useful to you in these different environments. And so I think that can be really, really powerful. And one of the, like I mentioned, I think in one of these slides, I used the phrase epistemological tension, which is something that I think a lot about in the context of my work, because I do a lot of like GIS-based mapping and sort of statistical comparison. And then I'm also engaging with this scholarship and like theories that are critical of that. And so I try to think a lot about like, what does this mean? Am I just like, am I trying to split my brain in two different ways? Are these things like inherently contradictory? Do I have to align these different epistemologies? And one of the ways I've begun to sort of think about it is that like map making and scientific narratives and this kind of, participatory data collection that you're describing, like is a narrative tool, right? That people can use to explain what their experience is using a different language, scientific language is part of a culture that we have and that is like important, and that is like worth embracing. And it enables people to advocate for change in their community that can be really powerful, but only if it's like grounded in what it means in terms of like their experience and the kinds of adaptations that can be really useful from people's perspectives and in relation to what they experience in their daily lives. So I think that, yeah, I think what you're describing like is really powerful. And in my work, I'm interested in trying to unpack like what it means to be collecting citizen science data and what types of information and knowledge are meaningful, and like how you use different types of information and knowledge together to advocate for social change. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Ashley, very much. And we can take maybe one more from, yeah.
I just have one question, especially about this, because I'm sure that most of your research, most of the data would show that the hottest areas in the city, you're not gonna run out into a rural countryside and get, I mean, the heat is there, but it isn't the cultural piece of that, where you're stuck in the apartment. Fifth floor with a window that doesn't open. That's not gonna happen in our rural area. And in the west, I'm very straight like happening here. They're starting to gerrymander the cities so that the rural votes can outperform the urban votes. And they get in and then they start passing laws. In Arizona, they're passing laws for trying to, and would, except for governor, to cities really can't do anything about this. And you have the rural areas that are overruling any kind of cultural change. Right? I don't know if you're addressing, how you're incorporating that in. It's a huge issue that, I mean, so all of the community kind of things they want to do, they're saying that you can't spend a single penny of public money on that, on something that would encourage things that would lower that heat. I would say yes, but I just think that's a huge issue. Probably we should be looking at seriously because the rural people always vote. Right? And it's not to benefit. It's but it's really gonna be hard to solve these kind of problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, I don't know that I can provide like much insight or, I haven't done my own research to trace like what are the changes in the possibility of like public dollars being spent toward, these, I guess, like maybe heat mitigation in particular, but maybe like climate security investments more generally, right, at the urban scale. So I can't like necessarily speak directly to the dynamic that you're describing, but it dates back to like urban austerity measures that we've been seeing for decades, right? That there's like, withholding of public funds for all kinds of, community infrastructure that's needed. And so it's not necessarily a new thing.
Yeah, I know.
And in a way we need those investments now more than ever. Yeah, no, I mean,
As the heat.
Yeah, and it's not just about like, like what I'm trying to argue here is it's not just about cooling in the outdoor public realm. It's also about ensuring that people like have affordable, safe housing that is habitable.
Yeah.
Like that is an investment that we need to be doubling down on. And instead we're like withdrawing, public dollars from things like housing.
Yeah, somewhere outside of it. It's brutal. But and that's kind of what as you were talking through that, it's really a lived experience. It's not like who cares what thermometer says.
Well, I shouldn't put it that. I wouldn't put it that strong. I know I come across as like very critical of the thermometer, but I also like thermometers a lot.
If you're 75, it's way different than if you're 25.
And if you can't afford to turn on AC and you don't have it, so I mean, related to that.
Yeah. But now
I mean, places are going to become simply unlivable without air conditioning. Like I don't think we have fully wrapped our heads around that fact.
yeah, that's
That like we actually need air conditioning and people aren't going to survive
And better building.
and we have no real strategy for providing that. Yeah.
And I think you could look at it as cybersecurity. And then for national security, I think the thing is that the move away, like what happened in the last 50 years was globalization. We're going to now like almost like a federalism. We're going back to republic. We thought we had democracy and the full order. And Star Trek and Star Wars.
Okay, we've got one more question from the chat and then I think we will wrap up. And Stephen, I'm sorry, I unmuted you, then I remuted you, but you should be good to go now.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zoe, for this insightful lecture. So I tried to relate your research with my immediate environment. I'm from Abuja, Nigeria, and I'd like to know, because urbanization is happening at a fast rate here in Nigeria, in Abuja. And with urbanization comes a lot of deforestation, and the immediate effect is high heat rates. So I'd like to know if, in respect to your research, would you rather urbanization doesn't occur, or what particular sustainable means or ideas does your research point to when urbanization happens in a community that was formerly with lots of forest and has lost its forest due to urbanization? Thank you.
You know, one thing that was really shocking to me about, okay, like this is not comparable with the mega cities of the globe, but the research that I did in New York City actually showed that the shade from buildings provided like a really significant cooling effect. And people in Arizona and Phoenix actually call this something like shade surfing, right? That it's like a behavioral adaptation that you know which side of the street to walk on and you know how to, yeah, find the shade. I mean, I don't think that like density and urbanization is at odds. I mean, of course, there are ways to integrate ecological and aquatic landscapes into urban life. Like there's a robust field of urban ecology that has devised all sorts of ways. This isn't like a technological problem. It's more of like a political one. And like, how is this development process unfolding? I don't know. Is there some threshold at some level of density? Maybe like, I don't work on that, but I don't think that I don't think we can argue that like urbanization is at odds with thermal comfort. I think it's instead a matter of like, how are these processes unfolding and like, what are the politics that are determining that?
Well, and part of it in Africa is that the architecture that's been adapted or adopted is actually completely incompatible with the.
It's just like these concrete towers.
Yeah, towers. Whereas if you look at a Swahili settlement, you've got, coral block walls that are this thick. And so you walk in and it's cool.
Yeah.
And so it's, there's like this whole mixture of stuff as well that's making it. But I think shade surfing is totally.
Yeah.
In fact, I thought that would be something you could study. How do people move across the landscape?
Yeah.
Super important.
It is super important. Yeah. And how do you like strategically place infrastructure that enables people to
just walking to work in Atlanta in the
I
summer.
do it.
Yeah.
Walking out in here.
Absolutely.
Which side? If it's cold, I'm in the sunny side. If it's hot, I'm on the shady
Yeah.
side.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was really fun. It was really nice to meet all of you.
And Cleo, thanks for organizing this. This was great idea.
It's supported by everybody and my love of.
Yeah, I can tell there was a lot.
That's great.
Thank you, everybody. Be here. Have a great weekend.
So I think your integration of tenure is really important. The landlord